Thank you, gentlemen. Now, you'll have to prepare yourselves for the flood of questions that will come your way.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's quite remarkable.
This side is going to bring the questions.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. Yeah, yeah, pay him more money.
There's one right there. There's a question right there.
Pay us more money. Yeah, no. Yes, sir. We have a question. Where's the microphone? All right. Yes, sir. Thank you.
As I recall it, Todd, you're not the first speaker that has told us not to focus on LTIs and count safety on that.
Right.
So do you have any thoughts on why it's taken us so long to change away from that?
Mm-hmm. One reason it's so easy to see safety as an outcome. If you look at it as a product to be achieved, it's so easy and elegant to measure when it's gone bad. We have this problem that when you're safe, nothing happens. And so when nothing happens, there's nothing to measure, right? But I would actually suggest if we could pull away, like the eye story, right? It's so interesting to me to hear safe companies struggle to try to become even safer. Because then they start looking at stupid stuff, right? So if you've got 3 eye injuries, what I want to happen is I want the doctor on board the vessel to go and look at those eye injuries. They're eye injuries, for goodness sakes, right? But that doesn't mean that safety on the vessel, a heavy lift vessel, is at risk. What it means is there's lots of wind and it's dusty. Now we can learn from it, and I think we have to. I would challenge you guys to really look at how you verify and validate and confirm that your safety systems are working when the work is successful. So one thing you can do is look at what your critical processes are, your highest risk processes. And I define critical, at least in my brain, for things that when they happen, they're non-recoverable. So an energetic release of some type, right? That's non-recoverable. Once it happens, there's no, parachuting is a great example. As soon as you step out of the plane, you're committed, right? You know what I mean? There's no going back. I would look at those critical steps and I would ask this question. What are the critical controls that I have so that when we make this non-recoverable action, we have the ability to manage the consequence if it fails? And actually, that's much more elegant to measure, and it really encourages leadership to go out and look at different things. The quickest way, I don't know if you guys, if this is true internationally, but if I want workers to give me different answers, I find it's really valuable to ask them different questions, right? Right? So keep asking the same question louder, right? Doesn't seem to be very effective, but going out and saying, when you use a ladder, what will kill you? And they'll tell you. And then pausing and saying, and how do you defend against that killing you? That conversation, that's what we want to measure. And that look at your capacity is really a big part of what happens. And you do it all the time technically. This isn't a big jump for you guys at all. I mean, I promise you, in the work you do, you know how many other generators are in stores. You know how many seals you have, right, that you can call on when a seal fails, right? Not a seal, but a seal. You know what I mean? Well, any kind of seal. It's up to you, right? That same idea of managing capacity is a much more robust and resilient, sorry to use those words, but it's a much more resilient way to manage a system. You would not put a worker into heights and tell him to not fall. You would not manage that risk by saying, sign this form that says you took the don't fall training, right? Why do you put workers in fall protection? Who knows? Do you not know? Yeah, it's not to stop them from falling, it's to stop them from landing, right? You assume there's a 100% chance that worker's gonna fall. You don't manage the absence or presence of the fall, so why measure that? But you would wanna manage the absence or presence of the harness, right? The tie-off, the availability to tie off, all the things, and you're masterful at it. And I'll promise you this, and then I promise I really will shut up. Your teams that are good at this are not good at it because they count failures. They're good at it because they count capacity. They won't do a high-risk job until these 3 people are here and we have the right tool. right? And oh, cut the mic. Okay, I'm done.
Behavioral modification.
That's right.
I think you should take that personally. Great.
Tell me about this side of the room. Just go ahead.
All right. Yeah. It worked.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah.
Got money? No. I'm working on a scheme of reporting in our company. One is it's mandatory in aviation, another is that we use it for the safety management system. And I really try to encourage people to come with positive reports. And I think I have one. And I think for the last year I've had about 1.5 years, we have 600 reports, and I have one positive report. And during the training, during the talks, I really try to ask people to give reports of what is working. What do you think is good? How should I inspire people to come with good reports, with the positive things? Because it's, even though we communicate it, we don't get them.
How do we reinforce that behavior?
Well, I think that in this case, leadership comes in. Because what I notice is that after an accident that you want to investigate, there's lots of energy and resources and people available to make such an investigation possible. But now you come into your CEO's office, you say, great, we had nothing during the last shift. Let's investigate this. So I need so many people, so many resources, so many time. And I personally fully agree with you that it's ultimately extremely important that we find out what the secret is of success. I also tell my students, I mean, if you want to know how to fail one of my exams, it's very easy. You don't study, you don't sleep, you boop, and you, yeah, and that's how you get a fail. Well, and the laxatives, just joking. But what would be much better is to get an A+ student in front of the room and say, you passed, you probably wrote the best exam ever, and what did you do to achieve that? But I find that it's very difficult to convince organizations to make that move. So yes, we should have more success stories. Yes, we should have more insight in why things go the way they should go. Because ultimately, it's important that we understand the processes that lead to a certain kind of output. Because also from a behavioral point of view, it's ultimately much more successful to reward processes rather than outcome. So in terms of studying, you should reward the studying behavior of your child regardless of the outcome of what gets out of it. And ultimately, it's the studying that you want to have reinforced. And just like an organization, you want the way they operate to be reinforced. And then you need to know what works and doesn't work. So please invest money, time, resources into success stories. But also be aware that the industry has not been extremely good at learning from incidents. And I would be a bit worried, and I'm not really sure they're ready to learn from successes yet. But it's definitely worth an effort, and as a joint industry group, I'm quite sure that if you all agree that it's important and you spread the message, that it could happen. But it's not without pitfalls.
So if I can add to that, I would add two things. I would agree completely, and add to the fact that I think it's a deliberate decision how your management responds to successful failures. And so you want to look for the success stories. You want to look for they dropped a piece of steel and it landed right where they thought it would land, which is exactly why we do the pre-job planning and barricade the underneath the load, right? And we want to really build that success. And the other thing I would challenge you on, and I don't know how much time you guys have spent on this, that one of the issues you have is that you can't treat the near miss as if it were the event. So a near miss can't equate into punishment. So if I report a near miss, I don't want to get more training, right? Or I don't want to give a speech to every other crew. I want a near miss to look differently. The bigger challenge is that my guess is at this point in your journey that you really have two distinct categories of near miss. You have near misses where something bad happened and it could have been catastrophic. You learned from it, but you didn't have to pay the price. You also then have a whole category of events that I think are not near misses. They're actual events, but your safeguards worked. You have to be mature enough at the leadership level to realize when you have an event where the safeguard works, it's an accident without the consequence because we built defenses in. Those are the ones you have to look at and celebrate pretty aggressively. And that's a big part of sort of If we don't train leaders to deliberately manage safety in a more modern way, they're gonna fall back to just be more careful, or you can't fix stupid, which I hear all the time, right? And those aren't very profitable. Another question from this side.
All right. Stunning.
He's been rewarding it, huh?
Hang with me.
Yeah, we're taking over the room now. So I have a question for both of you. Actually, my perception of your presentations was that you were standing in fundamentally different corners when it comes to human performance, and where you thought you see people as the resource to harness, and what I heard from you today, Joop, is that it was more like the problem to control. And now you have to fight it out till death, who's right. But basically, do you see them as these points, these perspectives, as mutually exclusive, or is there a way to synthesize it? Is it context dependent eventually?
I think it is the matter of the difference in complexity of what you try to manage. And complexity is what joins us and divides us. Yeah. It turns out that in fatal accidents were in many cases the end result, the fact that it fatal was a rather straightforward and simple process. The fact that the accident occurred in itself was very complex and cannot be managed with 12 or 18 simple rules. But the fatal consequences could be managed with relatively straightforward rules. So it's like wearing your seatbelt. You don't get less crashes, but once you crash, you don't die. Yes, in combination with the airbag.
And I think you're exactly right. I think that you really have three types of events. You don't have high probability, low probability, or high significant, low significant. You really have simple events, complicated events, and complex events. And what's interesting is that complexity really takes what we say and combines it. It's really, I think of it, it's the place where process safety meets psychology, right? Because there's an interface there between the best process safety program in the world and the operator that uses that. And part of what we do is we manage incentives. But the problem with managing incentives is consistency is really hard. It's really hard. I mean, the question I would ask all of you is the idea of doing the right thing. It's a beautiful idea, but who's the judge of right? And when do we make that decision? And who draws that line, right? Because it felt like the right thing before I cut my hand off, but it's clearly not the right thing after I cut my hand off. And you have to think about that sort of nuance. And he's exactly right. Complexity is really our enemy. And that's probably the wrong message. I don't know if it's our enemy. Complexity makes the work we do incredibly interesting. Because and your workers manage complex systems all the time. Way more, like I was telling the MDs that these poor guys that have to sit with me, I told them straight to their face, they're the worst group in this room to write a corrective action plan. Because they are farther away from the work than anybody else in this room. And yet, a lot of the pressure for those corrective action plans are going to fall squarely in their wheelhouse, and they're going to have to make decisions about how that happens. Come on, you guys.
Come on.
Look at this one there.
All right. Great.
Yeah, don't let it drop.
This is wonderful.
Something I'm having trouble understanding in the last presentation, and maybe I just missed the point. The do it right the first time that I've always found paralyzes people, and it's impossible to do it right the first time, and goes against a continuous improvement mindset. So
what I mean is that once you, as an organization, have decided that there's certain kind of behavior that you want to reinforce, say holding the handrail or reverse parking. I mean, whether reverse parking or not has any effect on safety, that's not the point here. The idea is that you want people to reverse park. So my argument is then that once you've decided that, you shouldn't change your mind after 3 weeks and say, well, reverse parking, no we go front-end parking, because that will ultimately confuse people. So the continuous improvement, of course, doesn't stand in the way of gradual changes and gradual improvements. So when it comes to certain kind of behaviors that you really want to enforce, don't just react because immediately after an accident, you frequently hear people say, now we have to do this, now we have to do that. And what we also notice that kind of behavior then is changed after a few weeks because it didn't look like a good idea after all anyway. So it is an argument for accepting that people find it difficult to be told to do this, and then 3 weeks later, that, and that. So make up your mind when you are selecting the kind of behaviors that you want to reinforce. But again, this is about relatively simple processes. And the whole role of a leader is to some extent also accepting this distinction between simple and complex. And when it's complex, you need dynamic processes that are constantly adaptive to the local situation. But when it comes to simple processes, you can really ask yourself, what should we do to make the kind of behavior in our employees more effective? So that's where the first time right comes from.
What, in the face of ever-changing circumstances and shifting priorities, how does one go about being consistent? And how does one shift to relating to people in a completely different way? Because I think what's very alluring is to default back to everything I already knew and every way I already behaved. Kind of play it safe because this thing keeps changing. What's a practical thing people could leave here thinking about taking on that would shift something or draw a line that they can operate differently?
Every event is different, and your most powerful tool is your ability to learn. And that when something happens, the most important thing you do is access reality and study what happened. Not what you wish would have happened or what you thought would happen, what would happen. And to do that, you have to have the voice of the workers that were involved in the event. Once you have an understanding of what actually happened, that ability to learn is really powerful. But I would caution sort of one really important thing, is that there's a huge difference between learning and blaming. You can never do both. If you choose to blame the worker, then you've shut off learning. And the way you've shut off learning is it's a cognitive bias. Remember, the enemy of the question is the answer. So the minute I think dumb worker, dumb decision, right, then I've actually shut off my ability to learn and understand how the event transpired. If you choose to learn, then you can't go back and blame. And they're really sort of, it's like going east-west. You can't go east-west. You can't. They're opposing directions, and they're opposing sort of cognitive processes. Once you sort of snap to the fact that it's much more satisfying to know how the event transpired than it is to punish the worker, it's pretty interesting how rare you move towards discipline and punishment. The question I would ask you guys is, when you discipline a worker for not following a cardinal rule, what did you fix? Right? And compliance is not a safeguard, right? It's not. It's not. So rule following doesn't mean we will have no event, because events are a product of these complex systems that exist that way. And that's what I think about.
Yeah, but as you say, firing someone from a violation of a life-saving rule without a proper investigation would completely backfire. So no organization that tries to introduce these rules should just have as a, you violate, hop, you're fired, because then eventually people will stop reporting and you lose your learning ability. But when it comes to this consistency, there are two kinds of consistencies. One is between companies, as you sit here. So if you decide to reverse park, all reverse park, please. Yes, because that helps. But the other kind of consistency is over time. A CEO, a leader, is in the dynamic processes, and the oil price is high, oil price is low. But try for certain rules to be consistent in your behavior anyway. The third kind of consistency is within the organization. And that is usually a really big challenge. So you have the CEO saying, hey, you have the local leader who says, well, yes, well, okay. And then you have the supervisor, ultimately at the sharp end, who says, well, you must be joking. And employees have a very fine-tuned system to recognize differences in consistency. As children know that this is something for mommy and this is something for daddy, because they know exactly how to break this consensus thing. And so what you should ensure is consistency in the ranks too. And that is a major challenge. And not that they're bad people in between. I don't believe in the sick layer of poor management or whatever. But the whole idea is that consistency is so important, and that any exception from an important rule somehow creates confusion in the employee is something you should recognize. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should blindly always follow the rule. When you are in a situation where you are about to break a rule, where you are about to not reverse park, although you really think, the whole idea is that you then stop and ask yourself, why do I now want to reverse park while it isn't possible, and start a discussion about that. And so it's not that it's automatically always applied, but you should always have this little person in your head saying, there's a height there, there's a thing there, because that ultimately helps you to shape your behavior and the acceptance of the culture in your organization.
Got it.
I would just say that's the least reliable defense you could have.
Yeah.
Is the little person in your head. Got me in a ton of trouble. We can talk about it later, but I mean, and so you have to think about that. And I would suggest, I'm really struggling in my real job with the idea of cardinal rules, because they seem elegant and they seem incredibly simple, and these are the rules. When we sort of looked at them as sort of the 8 areas where we need the strongest systems, and so we took them away from the enforcement model and put them into the prediction model, we know when we work from height, we have the highest potential to kill people. We know when we work in confined space that we have a potential to die. We actually use that cardinal rule idea to manage the level of rigor we put around job preparation and defenses. That seemed to work much better. It's worked incredibly well for us. And it sort of took that enforcement mode off the table. We allowed that to be really a category of the 8 things we know have the highest potential non-recoverable fatality, and that's how we managed it. And that was a really interesting challenge for us. We're all in this struggle together, and if anyone tells you they have the answer, totally get it from them and call me, because I'd really like to know what the answer is. I haven't found it yet.
But still, Todd, at this moment, 86% less fatal accidents. I would say 1-0 for the psychologist.
1-0 for the psychologist.
Fair enough.
All right.
This fight is not over.
All right.
It's never over.
Gentlemen, I need to give these good people a break. Intriguing examination and a fascinating conversation. Thank you both very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.